Hello everyone, my name is Allison Woodside, and today we are going to be taking a look at school culture and its direct connection with school leaders. So the first thing that it's important to think about is that the principal really is the representation of culture and is the representation of climate. So what we're going to do is take a look at the relationship between all three of these, understand who is the principal, what does culture mean, how do those two interact, and what the problems are, and most importantly, what those solutions are. So the first thing we're going to do here is these are all the different aspects that are integrated into school culture. So we have the missions and visions, we have student leadership, conflict resolution, mentoring, behavior management plans. All of these pieces come together to form a culture in a school. And all of these pieces are directly influenced by the principal or the leader in the school. However, as we mentioned, there are a lot of complications with this as well. So what we're going to do is to start off with a general idea of what's going on and what is important. We're going to take a look at two different videos. The video from a perspective of a principal talking about the culture for students, and video from the perspective of teachers talking about the importance of the principal in creating school culture.
Welcome back to AACD 14. I'm Dr. Rod Berger with the Corps of Education and American Ed TV, standing here with Principal Kafele, Baruti Kafele, the Milken Award-winning educator. It's nice to have you on the program and really check in with you here at AACD. I know that you have best-selling books that you've got here with AACD, and you do lots of consulting and education. So my first question to you, Principal Kafele, is where are we with regards to the state of teaching in America, and what is really the true story behind how we're feeling about it with regards to just as a profession?
The state of education, that's a lecture.
Yeah, and teachers, right, specifically, like what is how do we, is it accurate what we're seeing when we see the press about educators in America and really, wanting to build the esteem just in the profession?
When I see the teacher bashing, I say no, that's not accurate. Because there are a tremendous number of excellent, extraordinary teachers in classrooms, but there are issues. There are issues in schools across the country. My area of focus is school climate and school culture, particularly in urban and rural schools. So when I see a teacher in a situation with children who are coming from challenging situations, challenging neighborhoods, or the home life, whatever the case may be, that kid is bringing that with him or her into a classroom. Is that teacher equipped to meet that need? Is the school climate and culture, when I say climate and culture, the mood and the lifestyle of that school conducive to meet the need of that youngster? In so many cases, it is not. So I'm trying to teach you math, reading, science, etc. in a climate and culture where kids may not be necessarily willing to embrace it. So if I can look at that mood, if I can look at that lifestyle of that school and look at areas where I need to improve it, such as the environment of learning, the attitude towards students, relationships with students, compassion towards students, and then relevance in instruction, whether or not I'm culturally responsive to the very learners in my classroom, then I can begin to make the kind of changes I need to make. So again, with the question, extraordinary teachers in the field. But there's some areas that we need to look at so that we can ensure that those teachers can maximize their potential as classroom teachers within their given schools.
So here, as we've seen, he's talking about how culture in the school plays a role on student learning. So what culture are we creating that's going to either facilitate or hinder student learning, and what culture are we creating for the teachers to pass on to the students? This next video is about teachers specifically, what they look for in a leader, what they look for in a principal to create a positive school culture.
Principal set the tone for the school. The principal sets the tone, and the principal sets that tone, sets the tone.
They're the one that set the tone for the teachers, and the teachers set the tone for the students. So whatever tone is set by the principal will travel on down to the students.
It's a trickle-down effect. If they treat teachers with respect and treat them as professionals, then they feel valued. A principal can make or break the success of a school.
The principal is the climate and culture of the school. That's where it starts, and they're the ones who set the precedent from everything that happens from the minute a student or a parent walks in the door until they graduate.
So once again, principals are the culture of the school, and the culture of the school is what directly influences the success of teachers and the success, even more importantly, of our students. So now that we've discussed kind of the general idea of the relationship between the principal and the school culture, what I did is took that a step further, because being in Ecuador, I've even encountered this phenomenon to a much larger extent. So my thesis, my main idea, is that the most challenging part of principalship is developing, changing, and instilling culture into a school, especially when ideals are shaped by a foreigner and even more so by a female. So being in Ecuador, I've noticed that trying to change culture, trying to influence culture as a school leader is much, much more complex because of the cultural aspects of Ecuador in itself that are built into the cultural aspects of the school. And coming in as an outsider and coming in as a female outsider in a very traditional setting makes this even more complicated. So one of the things we have to understand is that the expectations as a principal in a school are shaping visions of academic success for all students, creating a climate hospitable to education, cultivating leadership in others, improving instruction, managing people, data, and processes. However, these expectations are also varied depending on where you are as well. So once again, the culture of the school is going to, and the culture of the place that you are in, for example, Ecuador, is going to have a very big influence on these expectations as well. In Ecuador, for example, a lot of times we're focused more on managing people, data, and processes instead of actually thinking about the academic success of all of our students. The other thing that's important to recognize is that there are a lot of duties that principals are expected to complete in their role. If we look on page 125, there's a chart of a list of responsibilities that principals have from our Principals Field Manual. There are 21 different duties that principals have. And for me, out of all of those 21 duties, culture is the most important. And they define culture as fostering shared beliefs and a sense of community and cooperation. So all of these different expectations, many different duties, and within those, the influence of culture on everything else that is happening inside the school. So what are the challenges about culture? What are the challenges of creating culture and maintaining culture in school? So this first quote has a lot to do with what we specifically see here in South America and Ecuador. It says, "A coherent statement of who we are makes it harder for us to become something else. Strong cultures are tenacious cultures. Because tenacious culture can be a rigid culture that is slow to detect changes and opportunities and slow to change once opportunities are sensed, strong cultures can be backward, conservative instruments of adaptation." So, except for my spelling error, excuse me for that, part of the bad side of culture is having a strong culture makes it harder to change. So for example, in Ecuador, they have a very traditional culture, a very religious-based culture. And while that is incredibly strong, it makes it that much harder to change. So even though we see negative effects of what's going on in the school, low teacher morale, low student morale, things like that, that culture is going to be even more difficult to change because of the strong beliefs that the country holds and passes on to their education. So other challenges that principals can face in trying to change culture and instill culture is their age, location, preparedness, and even their pay. So for example, in age, being a young female principal is going to be much more difficult in Ecuador especially to change culture compared to a older, more experienced male figure. The location as well. Once again, in Ecuador, these types of changes are going to be done differently compared to maybe what would be done in the United States. Preparedness, as much as we've been able to study what it means to be a principal, it also means that, you know, in the moment of actually going to do the job, there's going to be a large difference. And then also sometimes the challenges for leaders are they don't necessarily feel the motivation or the reward, which sometimes can come in the form of monetary installments on a monthly basis. So the challenges of creating and maintaining culture, there are various. When talking about teachers specifically, what a leader has to do with their teachers, challenges can be that teachers themselves are also traditional. They don't like the idea of someone trying to tell them what to do and how to change something they've done for the past 25 years. In addition, seniority has a lot to do with it. So if I've been teaching for 25 years, How is this younger person going to come in and tell me how to do my job? And a lot of times when we try to make changes, we end up working simply with those who believe what we do instead of also addressing those who do not. And so only working with people on our side instead of trying to address the whole community. So these are the challenges in creating and maintaining culture. And now what we should do is take a look at what solutions there are. So resolutions to how to understand, address, and change culture. So how to overcome these difficulties and what actions to take. The first thing to do is do an assessment. So one of the things that we've talked about is when you're in a school, look at the whole environment. Don't just look at the details. Talk to teachers, talk to parents, understand what is going on in the school. Then what you have to do is internally describe important aspects of the school culture that you're inheriting. So what aspects of the culture do I understand and what is here? Then what we have to do is take a look at which aspects of the culture we don't agree with. So as a leader, what do we want to change? The next step in the assessment would be taking a look at what practices are the least popular. So what don't teachers like? What don't students like? What don't parents like? Make an analysis and a list of that. Then how do we plan to move away from those without affecting people? How do we create new practices? And which aspects of the culture do we want to keep? Okay, so that's the assessment that we need to do before a leader tries to change culture. Then, as I mentioned, the establishment and the practice of all of these new norms. So when we establish a new culture, we have to talk about efforts and achievements. We have to talk about expectations for teachers and for students. We have to talk about encouragement, rewards, and discouragement for maybe actions that are not necessarily along the lines of the changes that we would like to make. And then practicing and following through. If we're going to change culture, we need to follow through with all of the ideals that we want to implement. So communicating those expectations, protecting people from unnecessary pressures, recognizing success, assessing morale. This is incredibly important, is understanding how the teachers, how the students, how parents are feeling throughout the entire process, and establishing a safe environment. So all of these aspects are cultural, and these are all aspects that we have to make sure we are addressing when we're trying to overcome difficulties in culture. But number one, the assessment is the most important step to overcoming culture. So what do we want to change? What do we want to keep the same? And what steps are we going to take to get there? Now, in the application, this is where what I did is I took a look at what I've experienced in Ecuador and what my principal experienced here in Ecuador to these recommendations for steps that we can take. So number one is understanding your own leadership style. One mistake I believe I made was that I believe that my leadership style applied to every single one of the people that I worked with, and that's not true. We have to understand how our leadership style applies to each and every single one of the people that we're working with. Some teachers may not appreciate team leadership, and some teachers may appreciate that. So we have to understand our leadership styles and the learning and leadership styles of our teachers. Then understanding where you are. While I wanted to make changes in the culture, I didn't necessarily recognize and praise the aspects of Ecuadorian culture when trying to implement a change. So as we mentioned in the assessment before, just because I want to make cultural changes, I also have to recognize the strengths of the culture themselves. So that can create a lot more resistance when trying to implement changes. And it's important to come to terms with those differences and move forward in establishing these different things. So recognize the differences, have everyone on the same boat with what those differences are, and use those to move forward to establish a cooperative community, to talk about common goals, to talk about how we are going to solve problems, and to involve teachers, students, parents, everyone. And remember that ultimately student instruction is the most important. And then finally in the application, model what you expect. So this is what we say for our teachers to our students, and as a principal, as a leader, trying to instill culture, we have to model what we look for. And really finally understanding your limits. So me as a leader in Ecuador, I had to understand this relationship that we talked about. So what should I keep from the culture and what changes need to be made, and understand how far I can push it based on the needs of where I am. So main ideas here that we need to remember is that setting goals is really important. And these goals should not be simply based on the leader, on the principal. Okay, you need to set cultural goals for the entire school. Follow steps. Changing culture is something that needs structure. It's not something we're going to do overnight, and it's not something we can do without laying out some sort of plan. It's also important to reflect. Am I trying to push cultural beliefs onto a school that maybe I believe in and they don't? So it's reflecting on my actions and how they impact and work with the actions of those in my school. And finally, believe. One of the things as principals is that it can get really frustrating to try and change culture, and it can get really frustrating to try and influence those around us when they don't necessarily want to be influenced. So believe that we can do it and be persistent, just like we ask of our students. And finally, some extra resources about how to do improvement plans with culture, different planning guides, different articles about reflections on culture, and some of these resources you might find useful if this is something that you are struggling with as well. These are the references I used. So once again, culture is complicated, culture is important, and it should also be the first thing that we address when we go into a school. Thank you so much.